As Hashem, today's daf is daf Ayin Tes, and we're gonna just start. We're just gonna finish off with a story that we're starting off from about 11 lines from the top, 12 lines from the top of Ayin Ches Lamed Beis. So it starts with Hu Shchiv Merah. Okay, there was this Shchiv Merah is somebody on his deathbed. The Kosev La Gita de Dvesa. He writes a get for his wife. Bahadya Pani de Mali Shabbos. It was Erev Shabbos. It was Friday afternoon. Right? He's writing a get for his wife. Why would somebody write a get for his wife? He's going to die anyway. The answer is very simple. Because he has a bum of a brother, and he doesn't want his wife to fall to Yibam to that brother. So it's Friday afternoon, but he did not have a chance to give it to her. Lamachar, the next morning on Shabbos day, Takafle Alma, he's really in a very in a serious critical condition, and they're afraid that he's going to die on Shabbos. The problem is, so why don't you give the get? A get is muktzah on Shabbos. The get is laying there. Let's say it was laying there on the floor. So the get, he can't pick up the get. It's muktzah. You see this? So even the guy is dying, and he wants to give a get to his wife, but he can't touch the get because it's muktzah. So also the Kami to Rava, they came to Rava to ask him what to do in this situation. Amalehu, Rava had a good advice. Zilu Amr Lechay, tell them, let him have a mind that he wants to sell that piece of land that's right underneath the get. Let's say it was in his house. That that square inch area that where the get is, he wants to sell that to her, or that room where the get is. She should open and close the door of the house, so she shows of the room that, let's say the getter was in a room, so she should buy that room on Shabbos. You can't buy by paying money for it, but you could buy something on Shabbos in this circumstance by doing chazaka. What's called chazaka? Closing the door. Let's say you buy a field and you close the fence. That's enough of a chazaka to make it yours. The Tanah we learned in the Mishnah. Noal godo paratz kolshu. If you close a door, or you put up a fence, or you make a hole in the fence, even a little bit, harei chazaka. That's a chazaka that you own the property. So once she owns the room where the get is lying, we know another din that when you buy karka, you automatically buy the movable objects on top of it. For example, if I buy a field, I automatically, if I purchase the field, I could acquire the tractor that's on the field because it's a movable object. So therefore, Rava gave the idea that she will purchase basically through chazaka the property that the get is on, and automatically she'll be able to be kind of the get on Shabbos, and they solve the problem of muktzah that they can't move the get on Shabbos. She doesn't have to.
But then she owns the room.
She owns the room. Okay, so she owns the room, and then she owns the room. Maybe she'll pay for it after Shabbos, or she'll sell the room back. But at least temporarily, she owns the room. So Rav Elish asked the question to Rava: does that work? Mashakonsi isha konabala. If she owns the room, automatically whatever a woman buys, her husband owns it too, and she has to totally own the room. And not that the husband has any ownership. And anytime a woman buys something, your wife buys something, it's automatically you own it as well. Ichsev. So Rava was embarrassed about his psak. The soif iglei milsa. It turned out that arusa hava, that this couple was just engaged. That means they never really had chuppah. And you don't say Amar Rava im Amar b'nesua. By a married woman that went under chuppah, you say whatever the wife owns, the husband owns. But Yami ben Arusa, you're going to say that by an Arusa, somebody who's just engaged. So therefore, she could acquire that property without without her husband have any part ownership of that. That was the psak halacha. On the Hadam Rava then really thought about it and said, Loishna Arusa, Loishna Sua. It doesn't make a difference if she was an Arusa and a Sua. Even if the property belonged to her and they were married, and whatever she owns, he owns. But when he's giving her a get, it happens simultaneously that he's relinquishing any ownership that he has in that property. And you say this idea, Gita v'chatzera boin ke'echad. The get and the courtyard simultaneously come together as one, belonging to her. And therefore, we disregard that he had an ownership in the property before, because by the time he gives the get, he's relinquishing ownership of that property. So that was the idea. Says the Gemara, "V'amar Rava mikara." Why didn't Rava think of this before? I mean, this is the Rava said this once before. Gita v'chatzera barim ke'echad. Answers the Gemara, Ki Amara Rava Hamaisa Amra. This was the story that inspired Rava's mind to think about this idea, Gita v'chatzera barim ke'echad. And that's why you have to remember it. When a woman, let's say, is deeded a property, let's say it comes from her father's house and she owns that property, the husband has a right to have the rent of that house. But when he throws the get into that house, he's not an owner of that property anymore, and he's relinquishing owner at the same time. It becomes totally her property, and with that, she could be kaina the get. Now we're going to go back into the Gemara and say, we learned in the Mishnah that in order for a woman to receive a get in her house, let's say she owns a house, and he threw the get into the house, she has to be in the house. If you threw a get into her field or her courtyard, she has to be standing there as it lands on the floor. You don't have to put it into her hand. Ula said that the Mishnah means to say, she has to be standing at the side of her house on the side of the chatzer. Rabbi Shaya says, no, she doesn't really have to stand there. As long as you know that she owns the house and she owns the chatzer, it's good enough. The Chatzera b'tzipara, even if she's in Tiberia and the courtyard is in Tzipari, he b'tzipari v'Chatzera b'Tiberia, and or if she's in Tziparo, it's Tzipari, and the courtyard is in Tiberia. In other words, she's not standing right there when her husband threw the get. Mugresha, she remains divorced. Asks the Gemara on Rabbi Shaya, what do you mean? But our Mishnah said that if you throw it into the courtyard, our Mishnah says that she has to be within her courtyard and in her house. So what does it mean that Rabbi Shaya does not require you to be in the house? Answers the Gemara Hachi Kama. This is what Rabbi Shaya meant, what the Mishnah means to say. If it's her house and it's in her courtyard, then even though she's not there, we consider it as if she's standing there. The Kavan the Chotzim Ishtameres Ladata, it's a courtyard that's being watched under her jurisdiction. I mean, she's responsible for that courtyard. Miskaresha, she becomes divorced. But let me tell you, that only works if you give it into her courtyard, even though she's not there. But let's say you give the get into the hand of a slave that she owns, she would not be Magreshus. Why? Because who's watching the slave? The slave. So it's not something that she is watching over, because the slave is watching out for himself. So she would not be divorced. But if you throw it into her chatzer or into her house, even though she's not there, Rabbi Shaya holds it's a good get, because it's a chatzer that's mishtameres l'dat. It's a courtyard that she watches consciously, even though she's not physically there. So the Gemara says, Leima b'hokami palgi. Let's say this is the argument. How do you know you can divorce a woman by throwing it into her courtyard? You don't have to give it into her hand. The Marsava Chotza Mishim Yoda Misraba. So we're going to say that Rav Ula holds that the whole reason why you can include courtyard is because it's like the Torah says hand. It means includes, you can throw it into her courtyard, and therefore she, just like your hand is next to you, in order for her courtyard to be kind of the get, she has to be right next to the courtyard. The Marsava, but Rabbi Shaya holds Chotze Mishim Shlichus is Rabbi. Chotze is included because of like you can send a messenger to accept the get. She doesn't have to be right next to the messenger. Messenger you can send and accept the get on your behalf. So Chotze is like a shliach that accepts the get on her behalf. Answers the Gemara, lo, you don't have to say that's the machlekes. The Kuliyama, everybody holds Chotze Mishim Yada Israba. Everybody holds the reason why a courtyard works is because it's included in her hand. Marsava Kiyada. So Rav Ula held it's really like her hand. Ma Yada B'smucha, just like a hand accepts the get when it's right next to you. Afkatzera B'smucha. So also the courtyard, it's right next to her, and she has to be standing nearby the chotzer and seeing the get being thrown into her courtyard. The idach, but the other man, the Alma holds, no, she doesn't have to be there, because if you're going to compare it to a hand, just like the hand is connected to her body, you're going to say that the courtyard has to be connected to her physically. It's not. It's impossible. It's a piece of land. Ella, what he said, if you're going to compare it to a kiyada, like her hand, you say mahayada mishtameres l'data, just like a hand, it's guarded according to her consciousness. It's according to her courtyard that she watches consciously. Let's say she has a video camera there. So she doesn't have to physically be there. We exclude a courtyard that's being watched without her conscience. Let's say you give it, like we said before, if you give it to her the hand of a slave, it's not going to be a good get. Okay, now a story. Ahu Gavra, there was this man, the Zorak Lagite Litvesi, threw a get to his wife. Okay, now, have a kaima b'chotzer. They were in a courtyard. Okay, an open courtyard. Ozagita v'nafal b'pisla. And the get fell on an open board, let's say on a shelf, or somewhere there was a board up there, and it fell on a shelf. Amar Rav Yosef says, Chazina, let us observe and see how big the shelf is. If it's 4 by 4 amas, then plagle rishus lenafshe. Then it's his own separate rishus, and she's not divorced. V'ilai, but if it's less than 4 amas by 4 amas, chade rishusi, it's considered part of the courtyard. So there's a lot of stuff missing in the story. But Mayaskina, what are we talking about? The get was thrown into a courtyard. It landed on a shelf in the courtyard. Ilema, what are we talking about? She owns the courtyard. So kihava dalar amas mahava. Who cares if the shelf was 4 amas? It's her courtyard. So everything in that courtyard belongs to her. So why is she not mugureshes? Ella b'chatzah the chatzah belonged to him. Ki loy hava abba amas mahava. If the chatzah belonged to him, even if the shelf is not 4 amas, it's not her courtyard. So it's not in her domain that she could acquire the get. Answers the Gemara like tzricha. It's not talking about, this is the situation over here. Really, he told her he wants to give her a divorce. And he's in his own courtyard and she's in his own courtyard. So he threw the get. Now, technically, he hoped that the get would land on the floor. And it's his courtyard. The oishla mokaim. He's lending her the space where the get is going to land. So therefore, if it lands on the floor, fine. But if it lands on a shelf, he overshot the runway and it landed on a shelf somewhere. So then he didn't mean to give her, to lend her that spot where it landed. If it lands on the original, a person lends his wife only one space for the get landing, but not 2 spaces. So he didn't have in mind that it would land on a shelf, and if the shelf is 4 by 4, it's considered its own entity, and therefore not part of the chutzner. That where it landed was never loaned to her, and that plank doesn't belong to her, and therefore she's not mugareshes. We didn't say it that she's not that she could be mugareshes if it's less than 4 by 4 amas. If it wasn't height 10 tvachim, if the height off the ground was 10 tvachim, even if it wasn't 4 amas, it's considered a separate entity, and she would not be megreshes if the get landed there. We also did not say ela the less leishem levei. If it didn't have, it's a bar. We go to Chesam and Al. If the less leishem levei, it didn't have a borrowed name. Let's say it's called a built-in shelf or something like that. If it had another name, a very known name, so that differentiates that plank, even if it's not high 10 tvachim or not 4 amas, it would still be a considered a separate entity, and she was not going to be mugaresh as New Gemara. We said in the Mishnah that, let's say the husband and wife are sleeping in bed together, right? And he gives her the bed. He gives her the get in the bed. And who belongs the bet? It's his bed. So she's not mugareshes. Amar Rava said, Loi Shani was not taught El B'mita Shaloi. If it was his bed, she's not mugareshes. Ava B'mita Shaloi, if the bed belonged to her, and albeit the house belongs to him, but it's her bed, and the get lands on her bed, mugareshes, she's divorced. Hanyanami Hochli, the Brisa says the same thing. Rabbi Lezer Oiba, B'mita Shaloi, only if he owns the bed, ain't mugareshes. B'mita Shaloi, mugareshes. But if it's her bed, she is mugareshes. Now the Gemara asks the obvious question: B'mita Shaloi mugareshes, if it belonged to her, she's mugareshes. But at the end of the day, the bed is in his house, and therefore, we hold that that's not that it's a machlokes in the Gemara whether that can work as a kinyan. In other words, let's say I want to buy something from somebody, and I bring a shopping bag into the house and put down my shopping bag in his house, and he puts the item that I'm purchasing in the shopping bag. That's called kelev shalakeach. The vessels of the purchaser b'rshus meicherhu. It's in the domain of the seller. Am I koine or not? At the end of the day, I don't own the property where my shopping bag is staying. So same thing over there. Even though the bed belongs to her, but the house belongs to him. So how does it work? How could she be koine? Shamit Minei, will you deduce from there that the vessels of the purchaser in the domain of the seller would work, and a purchase would be valid, that the purchaser can acquire items that way? Answers the Gemara, the Gavoya Asar. Really, the bed is really not a kalim anymore. It's like its own rishus, it's its own domain, because it's high 10 tvachim. But the Gemara is still not satisfied. But you can tell me it's high 10 tvachim, so it's not really considered in his house. It's like its own private domain within his house. But the feet, the legs of this bed is standing in his house. So the answer is, I'm koin kari lekapti inshi. People are not makbid if she's not gonna. People are not makbid or demanding that they don't mind if her legs of her bed is in his house, because it takes a very little space. And so therefore we disregard that, and we look at it as her rishus within his house. And if the get landed on her bed, she could be kind of the get. If it lands in her lap, or in her basket, mugreshes, she becomes mugreshes, right? So let's say she put her basket in his house, and he threw the get into her basket. Same question. Amai, if her basket is on his floor, on his floor of his house, how could she acquire the get? This is the vessels of the purchaser in the domain of the seller. It shouldn't work. Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel Kagain Shaisa Kalta Tluya Boy V'chein Amar Rabbi Amar B'Shoy Aishaya Kagain Shahalta Tluya Boy. It's not that the basket was on the floor in his house, but the basket was hanging around her neck, let's say, and therefore it's on her body. If it's tied to her hand, let's say it's tied to her wrist, even though it's on the floor, that's okay also. Rav Ada Barahava said that it's talking about the basket was in between her knees. Let's say she's sitting in a chair or something, or standing, and she's holding the basket in between her knees, but it's not on his floor. So therefore, he could throw the get into that basket. Rabbi Sharshi Bar Avdin Yoma. We're talking about her husband who sells baskets. If he sells baskets, so there's baskets all over the place, so then he doesn't mind if you put down another basket. It's not going to disturb him that her basket is in his house. And if it's not disturbing him, then he could technically, it's her space, and therefore he's like giving her this space where her basket is resting, and therefore he could throw the get into that basket. He gives her over the space of her lap, or the space of her where the basket is laying. Where the basket is laying, nobody is makbid wherever the basket is. Amar Rava, my tam the Rabbi Yochanan the makbid loyal malkom chekev loyal malkom kalta. Tanya, and the person's not makbid. They're not going to say, "Oh, you can't. My basket is you put your basket on my floor. I'm makbid." No, if the husband's already holding by divorcing her, he's going to let her have that floor space where her basket is, and he'll throw the get in there. If he threw it into any type of basket that belongs to her, even though the basket's in his house, the Brisa says she's mugareshes. Kol davushu kakalta. What is something like a basket? It's a little bag that she eats dates with, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's a smaller type of bag. Even if maybe it's a large bag. Even if it's super large. If she puts it down on the floor, he doesn't mind that it's there, and he can throw the get into that basket. New Gemara, new Mishnah, a very fascinating case. Amalah, a man says to his wife, he says, here is a debt instrument. Honey, I have a debt instrument, a bond. I'm giving you a U.S. bond. But guess what? Or she found a document from behind the husband, right? She sees him walking and a document fell out of his pocket. She reads it, and it's her get. Ain't a get. Of course, it's not a get because he fooled her. It's not her shtar choiv. It's not a deed, a debt instrument, a bond. It's a get. So it's not a get. If he turns around and said, "Hey, that's your get," then it becomes her get. Let's say he gives a get into her hand and she's sleeping. She wakes up. She reads it, and it's her get. Ain't a get. It's not a get. Until she says, "This is your get." So that's a very interesting thing. So now let's say one of the cases in the Mishnah is she sees something falls out of her husband's pocket, and the question is she picks it up and it's her get. That's not a good get unless he said, "Hey, that's your get." So the Gemara says, "Ki amala hey gitach my hava." If he would tell her, "This is your get," so what? The Torah says you have to give the get into her hands. You can't say put it on the floor and say to your wife, "Pick it up." If you say that, that's not a good get. So how is it that even if he turns around after she picked it up and said, "Oh, that's your get," but she picked it up off the floor, and therefore, it should not be a good get. He has to give it to her. So the Gemara says, "Ema, you have to say she took it out of his back pocket." So the Gemara says, if she took it out of his back pocket, he never gave it to her in her hand. So how does that work? He bent over backward, made a movement with his hips to stick it into her hand. So that's how he gave it to her. Tanya Nami Hachi, we learned in the Brisa, Amala Kinsi Shtar Chayvzel, Aisha Shlaftim Achayrev, Karatu Vahari Gita, Vare Gita, and Agat Shemala He Gita. Now, Brisa gives the same case. A man says to his wife, "Here's your debt instrument." Or he stuck it out and he banged it into her like from his back pocket, and she reads it, it's her get, she's not a get. But if he turns around and says, while it's in her hand, "That's your get," then it's a good get. Divrei Rebbe. It's not a good get. You have to take it back from her. You have to take it back from her and say, "Oh, this is your get." That's case number one. Case number one is when he fooled her, telling her it's a debt instrument. You have machlokes between Reb Shimon ben Elazar and Rebbe. And now case number two is a similar machlokes. A man gave a get to his wife and she was sleeping. She woke up, she wakes up and this is her get. Ain't a get. That's not a good get. Until he tells her, "Hey, Gitach, this is your get." Divrei Rebbe. It's not enough to tell her, "Hey, ma'am, this is your get." You have to take it back from her because you gave it to her when she was sleeping. It doesn't become a get until you take it back from her and give it to her back as a get. So Reb Shimon ben Elazar and Rebbe have an argument in two cases. If the one case is if you told her it's a U.S. bond and then it turns out it was not, in order for it to become a valid get, Rebbe says all you have to do is say, "Hey, Gitach." And Reb Shimon ben Elazar says it's not a get until you retake it back from her. And the same machlokes was if you gave it to a get when she was sleeping, Rebbe says you have to, when she wakes up, you tell her this is your get. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar says no, you have to take it back from her and give it to her and say this is your get. Utzricha, we need this machlokes by two places. If you tell me the case number one, by he come a Rebbe, in the case of the debt instrument, because really she's a woman that's capable of getting divorced, so therefore she's holding on to the piece of paper. All you got to say, "Oh, by the way, it's not a debt instrument, it's not a bond, it's really a get." Maybe when you gave it to her in her hand and she was sleeping, a sleeping woman can't accept the get. Ema, in that scenario, maybe I would say that he would agree to Reb Shimon ben Elazar that they have to retake it back from her and then give it back to her to say it's a good get. But if it would say in the other way around, if you just say the argument is by sleeping, I would say only sleeping case because the woman is not capable of accepting a get. That's why Reb Shimon ben Elazar says you have to take it back from her. But if she was a normal woman, you just fooled her and you say, "Here's your U.S. bond." So Eamon made it later Rebbe. Maybe he would agree to Rebbe that you don't have to take it back from her. You could just say, "Oh, by the way, that's your get," and that would be enough. That's why we have to say the argument in both cases. Amarava, new Gemara. Kasav la get n'sana biyad avdo yashin mishmarte. Let's say you wrote a get, you gave it to the hand of her slave. He wrote the get and gave it to the hand of her slave who was sleeping, and she is watching the slave. Hareze get. But Neir, if the slave was up, ain't a get, it's not a get. Why? Now the chotzer because this is a chotzer that doesn't need her to watch it, because the get once he's awake can watch himself. So giving the get into his hands is not a good get. So the Gemara asks the question: Yashin Mishmarta raise a get. If he's sleeping and she's watching him, that's a good get. Amai, why is that a good get? Chotzer mahalechas he potentially he could walk. The chotzer mahalechas like kana, and the potential things if a chotzer can be moving around, it's not kaina. Let's say a moving vehicle, a moving vehicle is not kind of get. Are you going to tell me Yashin Shani, the woman, the slave was asleep, so he's not walking around? If this thing has the potential to walk, if it would not be kaina, even if it's standing still, like kaina would not be kaina. So in other words, the sleeping doesn't help the fact that the evet is a being that's capable of walking. So the Gemara answers that it's talking about the Evid was tied up, and he can't untie himself. Let's say he's in handcuffs or something like that, and foot cuffs. So and he's sleeping. I guess you need both, sleeping and then he's handcuffed. Only that if you give the get in her hand, will it be okay? New Mishnah. Haisa Aimedes. We'll do another few more minutes. Haisa Aimedes, 3 more minutes. Haisa Aimedes B'Shus Rabbim Mizraka Law. A woman was standing in the Rishus Rabbim, and he threw the get to her. Karv law mugareshes. If it's close to her, she's mugareshes. Karv law. Let's say the get is close to him. Ain't a mugareshes. She's not mugareshes. Mechza mugareshes ain't a mugareshes. If it's half and half, she's then if it's like close to him or close to her, she's mugareshes, not mugareshes. In other words, when you throw a get when he's throwing a get to his wife, it has to be totally close to her. If it's still, close to get, he has a bad arm and he didn't throw it too far and it's more closer to him, then she's not mugareshes. But if you're not sure, it's 50-50, it's close to him and close to her, then she's a suffix mugareshes. The kedushin, the same idea would hold regarding kedushin. If you have kedushin money, if you threw it to her and it's close to her, then she's mekudeshes. If you threw it, but it's still closer to the man, then she's not mekudeshes. Mechza, then she's suffix kedushin. Let's say a lender threw the money to his a borrower threw the money to the lender, and the lender said, "Throw me the money," and he threw it. Zraklai, and he threw it closer. Karav lamalva, if it's closer to the lender, Zacha malva, the malva owns it now, and therefore, if it's lost or stolen, you don't make the borrower repay the debt. He threw it, and that's it. Karav lalayva, but if it didn't land close to the lender, it landed closer to the borrower. Halayva chayev, the borrower is still responsible to pay the loan back if something happened to that money. Mechza, but if it's in between them, it's exactly 50-50. Shneim yachleiku, both of them split the loss. Let's explain this. Hey Chidami, let's explain the Mishnah. What does it mean you throw a get that's closer to her? Hey Chidami karav law, hey Chidami karav loy. What's closer to her or what's closer to him? Rav gave one explanation. You're in the Rishus Rabbim. You're on the Central Avenue. So if you throw it Arba Amashallah in her 4 amas, because everybody in their Rishus Rabbim owns 4 amas. Zakar of Loy. That's called you're throwing the get closer to her. Arba Amashallah. If it lands in his Arba amas, Zakar of Loy. That's closer to him, and therefore it's still connected to the husband. He didn't give the get. Hey Chedam Mechta Mechta. So what's called a 50-50. They're both standing in the same 4 amas. They're both standing in that one box on the sidewalk. So the Gemara says, let's see who came there first. What do you mean that's 50-50? If the woman showed up to that box first, then it's her 4 amma domain. If he showed up, then it's his. What does it mean? Did they both land into that sidewalk box at the same time? That's an impossibility. We paskin that you can't do things exact. You have to determine who came there first or not. So that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. Rav Kahana explained, we're talking about that actually 2 boxes apart. Let's say they're exactly 8 amas apart from each other. And what's the case? The get yoytze me'arba amas shaloi. We go to Amid Beis, Ein Tesa Amid Beis, and the get is Chesam Beis, and get yoytze me'arba amas shaloi l'dam amas shaloi. The get is somewhere in the box in between them. It's like on the line between the 2 boxes. So it's part in his 4 amas and part in her 4 amas. So it's 50-50. So the Gemara says, why is that a good get? Va'agid Bey. It's totally. He's totally connected to it, and we get has to be totally given over to her. And other than that, it's still considered as if he didn't give a get because of nasam biyada, and it has to totally leave his reshus. Ella Rabba Rav Yosef the Amrei Tavayu Hacha b'shtei kite edim askinim. We're talking about there are 2 witnesses. Achas Aimeres Karvloi. There are 2 witnesses. Once he threw the get. One pair of witnesses that looked closer to him. The Achas Ameris, one pair of witnesses, no, it was Karavla, it was closer to her. So there's 2 witnesses disagreeing with each other. So now that you have this disagreement, you say she's a Suffolk Bukareshes. So that's the case of the Mishnah. Karavla, it has to be in her Dalar Amas. Karavla, it's not in her Dalar Amas. Let's do one more piece, another minute, and then we'll stop. Rabbi Yochanan says, Karavla doesn't mean you have to throw it to her 4 Amas. Even if it's 100 amas away from her, if she can see it, that's considered enough for her get. If it's close to him, it's in his 100 amas. What's called mechza mesa? How can you picture this? So Rabbi Yochanan needs explanation, and Rabbi Yochanan is explaining like this: I have the explanation of what Rabbi Yochanan meant, and the answer is like this. Who yachal shamrei? If he could still guard it, and she can't guard it. So let's say it's in his. They're on a football field, but it's closer to him. He has view of where the get is. Zehu karv light. Then the get is still close to him, and she's not mugareshes. He yachal shamrei. Let's say it's far away from him, and the only one can really guard this get from, let's say, a bird coming down and grabbing it. Then zehu karvla, then it's closer to her because she can guard it, he can't guard it. Shneim yichayim l'shamrei, if they both can watch the get, or shneim ein yichayim, both cannot watch the get. In other words, you need each other to watch the get. No one can watch it by themselves. They need each other to watch it. I mean, that each one cannot watch it by themselves. Zehu mechza, that's considered half and half, and that's how you explain Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan is lenient. He says you don't even have to have the get land right in her amas. It could be 100 feet away from her, but as she can be watching it, that's enough to be considered that she gets the get. That Rabbi means that they told Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yonason in Bavel said the same shot in the Mishnah like you. And Rabbi Yochanan commented and said, wow, I didn't know that the Babylonian people know how to learn like me. So 2 more lines. Tanya Nami Hachi, Rabbi Lazo Oima. Kol Shehu Karvla Miloi. If the get is closer to her than to him. Uva Kelev Nutole. And then after landing closer to her, a dog took it. Ain't a Magrashes, it's not Magrashes. What do you mean? So that means she was divorced and then a dog ate her to get. And then she's not mugarashes. Why not? She was she had the get already. Ain't mugarashes kol heicha the tinta v'teza. Does she have to watch it forever? I mean, every get she gets that she receives, if her dog ate the get, that doesn't mean she's not divorced. So what did Rabbi Laza mean? This is what it means. Kol shekarav la miloi. If it's closer to her than him. If a dog would come and take it, he could watch it, but she can't watch it. Ain't magrashes. That means, let's say he threw it to her, but there's, let's say, a little body of water, even though it's close to her, but there's a body of water separating her from the get. So if a dog came and grabbed the get, she wouldn't be able to shoo away the dog because there's a body of water blocking her. So therefore, even though it's further away in feet from him and closer to her in feet, but because she cannot block a dog who would come and grab the get, she's not mugareshes. That's what Rabbi Laza meant to say. So what you do see from Rabbi Laza is that the get doesn't really have to land close into her dalat amas. It could be farther away, and she could still be considered mugareshes. Okay, we'll continue Bez Hashem tomorrow.
Yeshkoach.